Mourning Margaret Donovan signed for her inheritance. The sky over Caldwell County was the color of a bruise. She stood in the parking lot of a convenience store off Route 9, her phone pressed hard against her ear, her older daughter Lily watching her from the back seat of a car that was 3 payments behind, while her younger one, 6-year-old Rosie, slept curled against a duffel bag stuffed with everything they had managed to grab before the locks were changed. The voice on the other end of the phone belonged to a lawyer named Arthur Prewitt, and he was explaining, for the second time, that her great-aunt Clara had left her something. Maggie had not expected to inherit anything from anyone. She had not expected, at 34, to be standing in a parking lot at 7 in the morning with her 2 children asleep in a car she could barely afford to fill with gas, watching the sky turn colors she associated with bad weather and bad news. She had not expected her husband of 9 years to drain their joint account and disappear to another state, with a woman she had considered a co-worker of his, but had apparently been something more for considerably longer. She had not expected the eviction notice, or the way the landlord's locksmith had arrived the morning after the grace period expired, with a cheerfulness that felt almost personal. She had not expected any of it. But then, she had learned in the past 8 months that the life you expect and the life you receive are 2 entirely different things. And the sooner you make peace with that truth, the sooner you can decide what to do next. Arthur Prewitt told her the property was located in Harrow Creek, a township in the eastern part of the county that Maggie had driven through perhaps twice in her life, and remembered primarily as a stretch of road where nothing much happened and no one seemed to mind. He told her the property had been in the family for a very long time. He told her it was not a house, not exactly, though there was a small structure attached. He cleared his throat before telling her the rest of it, the way people do when they are about to say something they know sounds unusual. The property, Mr. Prewitt explained, was a bridge. Maggie stood there in the convenience store parking lot and let the words settle. A bridge. Clara Voss, her father's great-aunt, a woman who had attended exactly 3 family gatherings in Maggie's lifetime and had spoken at 2 of them, had left her a bridge. Not land surrounding a bridge, not a house near a bridge. A bridge. The Harrow Creek Crossing, Mr. Prewitt called it. An old iron and limestone structure spanning the Harrow Gorge, built in 1887, measuring 240 feet in length, still technically listed as a county road easement, though it had not carried traffic since 1974, when the new highway bridge was constructed 3 miles south. Clara had owned it outright for 61 years. Now it belonged to Maggie. She almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because there is a particular kind of exhaustion that lives just on the other side of despair, and sometimes it comes out sounding like laughter. She pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth to stop it. In the back seat, Lily stirred, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders without waking up. She was 11 years old and had her father's dark eyebrows and her mother's way of going quiet when things were wrong. Maggie watched her for a moment and felt the familiar tightening behind her sternum that had become the background noise of her days. A sound like a rope being slowly pulled taut. She told Mr. Prewitt she would think about it. She thanked him. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time after the call ended and stared at the road without seeing it. Then she looked at her daughters, at the bags piled around them, at the gas gauge hovering above empty, and she thought about the word no. She thought about where no would take her. She thought about her sister Dana's couch, which had been offered and taken back in the same conversation. She thought about her mother's apartment, 2 bedrooms, and a lifetime of complicated feelings folded into 500 square feet of a building that smelled like cigarettes and someone else's cooking. She thought about the shelter intake forms she had already downloaded to her phone and not yet been able to make herself fill out. Then she thought about a bridge, She called Arthur Prewitt back 7 minutes later and told him she would take it. The family found out the way family always does, which is all at once, and with opinions formed before the news has finished traveling. Maggie's mother, Patricia, heard it from Maggie directly and responded with the long silence she reserved for things she found simultaneously incomprehensible and predictable. Her sister Dana heard it from Patricia and called Maggie while still in the middle of processing it, which meant her reaction arrived in real time, unfiltered and moderately unkind. Their cousin Brett, who worked in real estate and considered himself the financial authority of the family, texted a single message that read simply, "That bridge is worth $. You know that, right?" They were not wrong to be skeptical, and Maggie understood that. She was not the sort of person who needed everyone to agree with her in order to act. But she was also not so far removed from reason that she didn't register the looks and the sighs and the particular way her mother stirred her coffee when she was biting back what she actually wanted to say. The bridge was old. It was not in use. It sat on the edge of a gorge in the forgotten part of a county that was itself not exactly a destination. It had no structural improvements recorded since 1961. The county had twice sent notices suggesting that ownership of a decommissioned road feature carried liability concerns that the owner might wish to evaluate. Clara, who had owned it for 61 years, had responded to both notices with brief, polite letters stating that she was aware of her obligations and had matters well in hand. Patricia brought all of this up at the kitchen table of her apartment on the second Sunday after Maggie signed the paperwork, while Lily helped Rosie with a puzzle on the living room floor, and the afternoon light came in sideways through curtains that had been the wrong color for the room since 1998. "You're going to take on liability for a crumbling bridge in the middle of nowhere when what you need is a job and an apartment," Patricia said. Not as a question. Maggie wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the table surface and did not say what she was thinking, which was that she was already looking for a job, already had 2 interviews scheduled, and that the bridge, whatever it was worth, was the first thing in 8 months that was entirely and undeniably hers. Dana came over later that same Sunday with the specific energy she carried whenever she had something to say that she had already said to someone else and wanted the satisfaction of saying again. She sat across from Maggie and told her that Brett had looked into it and that the county assessed the bridge at $11,000, which after unpaid property taxes and whatever it would cost to properly evaluate the structure's safety, amounted to something close to a financial burden rather than an asset. "There's nothing there, Maggie," Dana said. "Clara was eccentric. Everyone knew that. She lived alone out there for 40 years. She probably thought she was leaving you something meaningful, but the reality is she left you a problem." Maggie nodded. She let Dana finish. She thanked her for looking into it. And then, 3 days later, she drove out to Harrow Creek for the first time. She went alone the first time. She left the girls with her mother, which required a conversation she had been putting off about how long they would be staying and what the plan was. A conversation that went about as well as those conversations ever go, which is to say, it ended with Patricia looking out the window and Maggie looking at the floor, and both of them deciding that the important things had been communicated, even though almost nothing had actually been said. Maggie drove east on Route 9 for 40 minutes, following directions that grew increasingly specific, and then suddenly stopped being specific at all, the way directions to places that no longer matter tend to do. She turned onto a county road that wasn't on her GPS app, then onto a gravel road that the app didn't acknowledge existed, and then she went slowly down a decline that ended in a clearing at the edge of a gorge, and she saw the bridge for the first time, and she stopped the car and sat there with the engine running for a long moment without moving. She had expected something sad. She had braced herself for ruin in the way you brace yourself when you know something is going to be disappointing. But you've decided to go anyway, because the alternative is worse. She had pictured something bent and rusted, something the color of defeat, something that would confirm the chorus of doubt she'd been living inside for the past week. She had prepared herself to feel nothing, or worse, to feel foolish. She had not prepared herself for what she actually saw. The Harrow Creek Crossing was not what she had imagined. It was not a simple utilitarian span of iron rods and wooden planks thrown across a gap in the land. It was something else entirely. The bridge was built from massive blocks of limestone, pale gray and deeply weathered. Fitted together with a precision that she would learn later was called ashlar masonry, the kind of work that took trained craftsmen and significant money and a kind of deliberate permanence that the people who commissioned it intended to last not decades, but centuries. 3 great arches anchored the bridge's body above the gorge, each one wide enough to drive a truck through if the truck had been going sideways. The stone curved into near-perfect semicircles that had held their shape for over 130 years, without so much as a visible crack along the crown. Wrought iron railings ran the full length of both sides, ornate and darkened with age, but structurally intact. Their posts decorated at the tops with a repeating motif that Maggie couldn't quite make out from where she stood. The gorge itself was narrow and deep, maybe 60 feet from the road surface down to the dry stream bed below. The rock walls dark and striated, scarred by water that no longer ran there. The trees on either side of the gorge had grown tall over the years, their canopies arching toward each other above the bridge deck, so that the whole structure sat inside a corridor of trees that felt almost cathedral. In the late morning light, the stone glowed a pale amber gold, as though something warm lived inside the rock and was thinking about coming out. Maggie got out of the car and stood in the clearing and looked at it, and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was small in a way that was not unpleasant. She felt the way you feel when you stand at the edge of the ocean or look up at a mountain range, the recognition of something that was here before you and will be here after, something that does not know or care about your problems, but somehow makes them feel more manageable anyway. She stood there for a full minute before she remembered to walk forward. The bridge deck was stone, not wood, laid in the same limestone as the arches and the parapets, worn smooth by the century, and more of hooves and wheels and feet that had passed over it before the highway took the traffic away. Weeds had pushed up through the joints between the stones in places, and in one spot near the center, a small birch tree, no thicker than Maggie's wrist, had somehow established itself in a crack in the parapet wall and grown about 4 feet tall, its white bark bright against the gray stone. Maggie touched the birch as she passed it and felt the paper-thin bark give slightly under her fingers, the way living things do. The bridge felt, despite its age and its disuse, alive in some way that she couldn't have explained to Dana or her mother or Brett in any terms they would have found useful. She walked the full length of it. 240 feet took longer than she expected, not because the distance was great, but because she kept stopping to look at things, to run her hands along the stonework, to look over the parapet down into the gorge below. The iron railings were rougher than they looked from a distance, the surface pitted and granular with old rust under her palms, but they held firm when she pressed against them. Whatever decay had occurred was surface decay, the kind that comes with age and weather, but does not necessarily go deeper. Underneath the rust and the lichen and the weathering, the structure was still itself. At the far end of the bridge, where the stone deck met the opposite embankment, Maggie found the cottage. She had known from Mr. Pruitt that there was a structure, but she had assumed small meant negligible, the word people use for something they want you to expect less of, so you can't be disappointed. The cottage was small, genuinely small, 2 rooms and a narrow kitchen built from the same limestone as the bridge, with a low roof line and a chimney that had partially collapsed on one side and been repaired at some point, with a different kind of stone that stood out like a patch on a quilt. Clara had lived here. For 40 years, Clara had come home to this edge of a gorge, in a county road that nobody traveled anymore, and had cooked her meals and kept her own counsel, and apparently found it sufficient. The door was unlocked. Not just unlocked, but ajar, slightly open, as though someone had left in a hurry, though Mr. Prewitt had told her the property had been vacant since Clara's death 11 months ago. Inside, the 2 rooms were dim and cool, the windows small, and the glass old enough to distort the light coming through them in interesting ways. The furniture was sparse and plain: a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, a wood stove that had been swept clean. Books were stacked on shelves built directly into the wall, and on closer inspection they were not the sorts of books Maggie had expected. No romances, no popular fiction, no Reader's Digest condensed volumes of the kind that accumulated in houses where people kept books for appearances. These were engineering texts, histories of civil construction, geological surveys. A complete set of volumes on masonry techniques published in the 1940s. A water-damaged copy of a book called The Art of the Stone Bridge, its spine held together with tape that had gone yellow and brittle. So Maggie stood in Clara's cottage and looked at the books and felt the particular discomfort of realizing that someone you had dismissed as a footnote in your family's story was, in fact, considerably more than that. She came back the next day with the girls. She had not planned to bring them, but Lily had found out about the visit the way Lily found out about most things, which was by being quiet and close and paying careful attention to what the adults in her life said when they thought she wasn't listening. And once Lily knew, Rosie knew within the hour, because Lily was incapable of keeping anything from her little sister for longer than 60 minutes when the thing in question was interesting. By 8 in the morning, both of them were dressed and standing by the door with their shoes on, which had never once happened on a school day, and Maggie looked at them and made a decision. The drive out was different with 2 children in the car. Lily had her phone and earbuds, but kept taking them out to ask questions, and Rosie narrated the landscape through the window in a running commentary that required no response and would have continued whether or not anyone was listening. When the bridge came into view at the end of the gravel road, Rosie went silent mid-sentence and pressed her face against the glass, and after a long pause she said, in the very serious voice she used for things that mattered, "That is a very old bridge, Mama." "Yes, it is," Maggie said. "Is it ours?" "It is." Rosie considered this with the gravity appropriate to ownership. Lily took her earbuds out and looked at the bridge from the front seat with the careful and skeptical look of a child who had heard the adults' opinions and had not yet decided whether to agree with them. After a moment, she said, "It's actually kind of incredible." Maggie felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a long time. "Yes," she said, "it kind of is." They spent the morning on the bridge. Rosie ran back and forth across it several times with the specific energy of a 6-year-old who has been given a large empty space and no instructions, her footsteps loud on the old stone, her voice bouncing off the parapet walls and returning to her amplified, which she found enormously satisfying. Lily walked the full length slowly, her hands trailing along the iron railings, stopping to look at the decorative ironwork on the railing posts. The motif, which Maggie had noticed but not examined closely the day before, and turned out on close inspection to be a repeated geometric pattern, a circle containing an 8-pointed star cast into the iron at each post. Lily photographed every one of them on her phone with the methodical thoroughness she brought to subjects that interested her. "What do you think this means?" Lily asked, holding up her phone to show Maggie the pattern. Maggie looked at it. I'm not sure yet, she said. But we'll find out. They ate sandwiches sitting on the bridge parapet with their legs dangling toward the gorge, and Rosie dropped half her sandwich and watched it fall the 60 feet to the dry stream bed below with an expression of mild philosophical regret. The light in the gorge was different at midday than it had been in the morning, the sun coming in at an angle that illuminated the stone walls in a way that made their striations and layers visible. The geological story of the land, written in lines of color, brown and gray and ochre, and a deep dark red that Lily said looked like rust or old blood, and then immediately apologized for because of Rosie. But Rosie was already on to something else and had not heard. It was on that second visit, sitting on the parapet and looking along the bridge's southern face, that Maggie noticed the first thing that didn't quite fit. The arches of the bridge were each built in the same style, the limestone blocks laid in careful courses, the curve of the arch achieved through a system of precisely cut, wedge-shaped stones called voussoirs, the central one at the top called the keystone. She knew these terms because she had spent the previous night reading 3 of Clara's engineering books in the cottage while the girls slept in the narrow bed, and she had learned more about masonry bridge construction in 5 hours than she had learned in the previous 34 years of her life combined, which was perhaps not surprising given her previous lack of occasion to need the information, but was still useful now. She knew what a properly constructed arch was supposed to look like. The keystones of the 3 arches were larger than they needed to be, not dramatically larger, not so large that a casual observer would notice, but larger in a way that Maggie's eye, trained now on what a keystone was supposed to be proportionally, found slightly wrong. They were also slightly different in color from the surrounding limestone, which could have been explained by a later repair, except that the color difference was identical in all 3 arches, suggesting a deliberate choice rather than a piecemeal fix. And in the face of each keystone, she now saw, was carved a symbol. Not the 8-pointed star from the railings, something different. A series of marks she could not immediately interpret, cut deep into the stone and shadowed with age, so that they were easy to miss in changing light, but visible in the direct afternoon sun, where they stood out from the surface of the stone like lines on a map. She stared at the nearest keystone for a long time, trying to make the marks resolve into something recognizable. They didn't, not that day. But she took photographs from every angle she could manage, climbing the embankment on the south side until she was close enough to fill the camera's frame with just the keystone and nothing else. Lily came and stood beside her and looked up at the carved marks and said, "That looks like letters, kind of. Or numbers. Old ones." Maggie looked at her daughter. "You think?" Lily tilted her head. "Maybe. Or like a code or something." She said it the way you say things when you're 11 and don't want to sound like you're reaching. The slight upward inflection that leaves room to retreat if you're wrong. But she didn't look like she thought she was wrong. There was a woman named Eunice Hale who lived in a house at the top of the gravel road, the last inhabited property before the road descended to the bridge clearing. Maggie had driven past her house on both visits without stopping, but on the third visit, Eunice Hale came out onto her porch while Maggie was loading the girls back into the car and stood there in a way that communicated clearly that she had something to say and had been waiting for a reasonable opportunity to say it. Maggie walked up to the porch. Eunice was somewhere in her late 70s, small and sharp-faced, with white hair pinned up and the deliberate, considered manner of a person who had spent a long time in the company of her own thoughts and had learned to value them. "You're Clara's girl," Eunice said, not a question. "Her great-niece," Maggie said. "I just inherited the bridge." Eunice studied her with the frankness of advanced age. "I know that. I heard about it." "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." The inside of Eunice's house was dense and warm, or every surface occupied by the accumulation of a long life, lived in one place. Photographs, small figurines, stacks of the kind of magazines that come as part of a subscription and pile up before you can get through them. A tabby cat occupied the center of the only armchair and declined to move. Eunice made coffee in a percolator with the concentrated focus of someone who considered this a serious task and was not going to rush it on account of a visitor. She sat across from Maggie at a kitchen table covered in a floral oilcloth and folded her hands and looked at her directly. "Clara was my friend for 40 years, she said. My best friend, if you want the truth of it. She was a private person. I expect you didn't know her well." Maggie shook her head, feeling the appropriate discomfort. "Not well, no. Family events." She was quiet. She was quiet, yes. Not because she had nothing to say, because she was careful about who she said things to. Eunice poured coffee without asking how Maggie took it and handed the cup across. She told me things she didn't tell most people. Things about the bridge. Maggie set her cup down carefully. "What kind of things?" Eunice looked at her for a moment in the assessing way of someone deciding how much to give. "Clara's family, your family, I suppose, never understood why she stayed here all those years. They thought she was stubborn or simple, a woman who couldn't think her way to a better situation. But Clara wasn't stubborn or simple. She was keeping watch." "Keeping watch on what?" Maggie asked. "On what she knew was there," Eunice said, "and what she was afraid someone else would find before the right person did." The kitchen was quiet except for the cat shifting in the armchair and the distant sound of Lily and Rosie's voices from the car outside. Maggie held her coffee cup and waited. Eunice seemed to be weighing something, turning it over. The way you turn over something heavy to find the right place to grip it. "The bridge was built by a man named Silas Croft," Eunice said finally. "You'll find his name on the original survey documents, if you look for them, which I imagine you will. He was an industrialist. That's the polite word for what he was. Which means he made a great deal of money in ways that involved other people doing dangerous work for very little pay. He owned the coal mines east of here, and 3 towns that existed primarily to service those mines. He built the bridge in 1887 to move coal wagons more efficiently, but that's not why he paid as much as he did to build it. He paid what he paid because he needed a place to put something. Something that required permanence. Something he needed to protect for a long time." Maggie's hands felt strange, too still on the table. She said, "What did he put there?" Eunice looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but contained the same warmth. "That," she said, "is exactly what Clara spent 60 years trying to confirm. She knew it was there. She had her reasons to believe it, but she was never able to get at it herself. The bridge doesn't give up its secrets easily. It was built not to." She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and produced a small envelope, creased and slightly yellowed, and set it on the table between them. "Clara left this with me. When she told me that if someone in the family came to take on the bridge, I was to give it to them, but only if I felt right about them." She tapped the envelope once with one finger. "I feel right about you. I don't know why exactly, only that you have her eyes. Not the color. The color is different, but the way they sit in your face, the way they look at things and want to understand them, rather than just get past them." Maggie reached for the envelope with a hand that was steady, steadier than she expected. She opened it carefully, not tearing it, though the urge to tear it was strong. Inside was a folded piece of paper covered in small, precise handwriting. At the top, it said simply, "For the one who stays." The letter was 3 pages, written on the backs and fronts of folded notebook paper in the dense, careful hand of someone who wrote slowly and chose every word. Clara Voss, who had sat in every family gathering of Maggie's childhood in the chair closest to the door and said little and left early, had apparently spent a portion of her long, solitary life composing this letter and was not going to rush it now. Maggie sat in her car in Eunice Hale's driveway and read it twice while the girls occupied themselves with a game in the back seat. And the second time through, she had to stop halfway and look up at the sky for a moment before she could continue. Clara wrote that she had found the bridge through their shared family's history, which was more complicated than it had been presented to her as a child. Silas Croft had been a business associate of their great-great-grandfather Horace Voss, a connection that had, at some point, curdled into something that involved disputed debts and an old written agreement and a piece of property that changed hands under circumstances that Clara had spent the better part of a decade researching before she understood what had actually happened. The short version, as Clara told it without any evident bitterness, was that Silas Croft had acquired something that should have come to the Voss family through an old inheritance, and rather than transfer what was owed, he had converted it. He had converted it into something physical, something that could be hidden, and he had hidden it in the structure of the bridge, which he owned outright, and which sat on land that was, as of 1887, as remote and inaccessible as any private land in the county. He built the vault into the arches, Clara wrote, and I have found evidence of this in his personal correspondence, 3 letters, photocopied originals, at the County Historical Society under the name Croft Meridian Collection, Box 14. He paid his engineer double the going rate on the condition of absolute silence. The engineer's name was Milo Dupre, and he emigrated to Canada in 1891 and left no record in the county after that. Croft died in 1903 and left no instructions to his heirs about the bridge, because the bridge had been sold by then to the county for the highway easement, and the county would eventually deed it to your grandfather's cousin, and through him it would come to me. Croft expected it to disappear into the county's inventory forever. He did not account for the stubbornness of certain women. Maggie read that line again. She felt something that was almost laughter, and this time she let it come out, just briefly, before she pressed on. Clara wrote that she believed the vault was located within the foundation chambers of the central arch, the middle one of the 3, accessed through a passage in the interior of the arch structure that was not visible from the road surface or the bridge deck above. She wrote that she had found what she believed to be the concealed entry point twice in her 60 years of searching, and had been unable to open it both times, once because she lacked the correct tool, and once because she had injured her hip on the embankment and had been forced to retreat before she could complete the attempt. She wrote, "I am not ashamed to say that the bridge is stronger than I am. This is not a failure of will, only of time. I've run out of the first and have too much of the second in the wrong direction. I am old, and the bridge is old, and one of us is running down. I would like the other one to win." She wrote that she believed the vault contained gold, not currency, not paper instruments of value, but physical gold, the kind of gold that a man who had extracted enormous wealth from the labor of others and did not trust banks and had reason to fear the legal exposure of keeping records might convert his assets into in a year, like 1887, when the conversion of capital to portable permanent wealth was a known strategy among men of a certain type. She had found a reference in Croft's correspondence to an amount, a figure she wrote out in the letter that made Maggie read the number 3 times to be sure she was parsing the digits correctly. She wrote it out in words as well, which Maggie appreciated, and the words were $319 million at current estimated gold valuation based on the quantity described and the spot price as of last year when I last calculated it, understanding that the number would be different by the time anyone reads this. Maggie looked at those words for a long time. She looked at the number. She looked at the words again. She looked out the front windshield at Eunice Hale's house, and then at the gravel road leading down toward the bridge clearing, which she could not see from here, but which she knew was there. The stone arches holding their position above the gorge, with the same unhurried certainty they had held it for 130 years. $319 million. She thought about Donna's voice on the phone. She thought about Brett's text. She thought about her mother's expression when she was biting back what she wanted to say. She thought about the lawyer from the county who had sent Clara letters about liability concerns. She thought about the locksmith who had come to change her locks with a cheerfulness that felt almost personal. She folded the letter and put it in her jacket pocket. Then she turned around and looked at her daughters. Lily was absorbed in something on her phone. Rosie was drawing in a small notebook, the tip of her tongue between her teeth in concentration. Two children who were 3 payments behind on the car they were sitting in, who had slept on a grandmother's couch and a shelter intake form she had not been able to fill out, who had packed their most important things in duffel bags and had not once in those 8 months complained in a way that felt like an accusation. Maggie turned back around and started the car. She had work to do. She began, as Clara had apparently begun, with the records. The County Historical Society was open Tuesday through Saturday, 9 to 4, and located in a building downtown that had once been a feed supply store and still smelled faintly of grain. The archivist was a young man named Thomas, who had the careful, slightly distracted manner of someone whose entire happiness resided in the physical presence of documents, and who brightened considerably when Maggie asked about the Croft Meridian collection. He retrieved box 14 from the back room with the reverence of a man returning from a genuinely important errand, and set it before her on the reading table without being asked to wear gloves, which suggested a level of informality that either meant the collection was not considered particularly valuable, or that Thomas's reverence was for the documents themselves rather than their monetary worth. The 3 letters Clara had mentioned were there, in a folder labeled Croft, Personal Correspondence, 1886 to 1888. They were written on heavy paper, in the expansive, unhurried script of a man who considered his own words worth preserving, addressed to someone identified only as R.M., which Thomas confirmed likely referred to Reginald Marsh, Croft's business manager, who had preceded him in death by 2 years and whose own papers had been lost in a fire in 1915. The letters were faded, but legible, and Maggie photographed every page on her phone before reading them, in case Thomas's informality turned out to be premature, and he later decided she shouldn't have. Clara had been right about the content. The first letter, dated March 1886, discussed the bridge construction in terms that were primarily logistical: material sourcing, cost projections, timeline concerns. Nothing unusual. The second letter, dated August of the same year, was different. It referred to a matter they had discussed in person and confirmed the arrangement with the engineer, the one whose name they both knew but need not commit to paper in this context, and stated that the specifications Dupré had drawn up were entirely satisfactory, and that the modification to the central pier, as they had agreed to call it, would not be detectable by any casual inspection and would require knowledge of the original plans to locate, knowledge that would exist only in 3 places: the drawings currently in Croft's possession, the memory of the engineer, and the record of this letter, all of which Croft intended to personally secure before the end of the year. The third letter, dated January 1887, was the shortest. It said that the construction was complete and that the matter was satisfactorily resolved. It referred, in the oblique language of a man who had been careful all his life, to a significant placement, so men noted that the bridge would outlast anyone currently living, and that this was entirely the point. It closed with a sentence that Maggie read twice, feeling Clara reading it over her shoulder. "What we build to last will last. The rest is noise." She thanked Thomas and drove back to the bridge. The structural reality of a 130-year-old stone arch bridge was more complicated than Maggie had initially appreciated, and she had not initially appreciated it very much. She had brought a flashlight on this visit, and also a notebook, and also, because Lily had quietly insisted, a first aid kit and a length of good rope she had borrowed from Eunice's garden shed. The embankment on the north side of the bridge descended steeply from the road to the base of the gorge wall, and while it was technically navigable on foot, navigating it while looking at the underside of a 240-year-old stone arch required a level of attention division that Maggie found more challenging than she'd anticipated. She left the girls on the bridge deck with strict instructions about not leaning over the parapet and went down the embankment on her own, using the rope Lily had tied off to the iron railing post without being asked, which was either excellent improvised problem-solving or a sign that Lily had been thinking harder about this than she'd let on. At the bottom of the gorge, she stood on the dry stream bed and looked up at the underside of the bridge, and what she saw there required another period of simply standing and looking, the way the first sight of the whole bridge had required, because it was not what she had expected. The underside of the central arch was not a smooth, uniform surface. It was not the clean half-cylinder of a simple masonry arch. There were features here, projections and recesses in the stonework, that went beyond what structural necessity would dictate, and which the passage of time had rendered nearly invisible under a century of accumulated moss and mineral deposit and shadow. She moved her flashlight beam slowly across the surface, and as she did, the features clarified, the way shapes in a darkened room clarify as your eyes adjust, resolving from formlessness into the outlines of deliberate, engineered things. There were two projections on the west face of the central arch, low enough that she could reach the higher one by standing on her toes. They were rectangular, about the size of her palm, slightly darker in color than the surrounding stone. She touched the nearer one and pressed, experimentally, and felt nothing give. She pressed harder, angling her hand differently, and still nothing. She tried pulling rather than pressing, and the projection moved, just slightly, less than a millimeter, but moved, with the stiff, reluctant quality of a mechanism that had not been operated in a very long time. Above her, at the parapet level, she heard Lily's voice. "You okay down there?" "Yes," she called back. Her own voice returned to her, slightly amplified by the arch above, the way sound always behaves strangely inside curved stone spaces. "Yes," she called again, just to hear it. She photographed the projection from 3 angles. She photographed the second projection. She photographed the wider surface of the arch face and the section of the gorge wall where it met the arch foundation, where something else was visible, a seam in the rock that ran in a direction that rock seams do not naturally run. Too straight, too deliberate, following a line that connected the base of the arch to a section of the gorge wall that had been faced with stone in a manner matching the bridge's construction, but slightly different in the finishing, the way a joint looks when 2 pieces of work have been done by the same craftsman, but at different times. A door, she thought, or the memory of a door. She stood in the dry stream bed at the bottom of the Harrow Gorge and looked at the thing that was either a door or the memory of one, and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in months, which was a very specific species of hope, the kind that is not wishful thinking, but actual genuine possibility with structural support, the kind that has evidence behind it, the kind that stands up when you look at it directly rather than dissolving under scrutiny the way wishes do. Above her, Rosie's face appeared at the parapet, looking down with her serious expression. "Mama?" "What are you doing down there?" Maggie looked up at her daughter. "Looking for something," she said. "Did you find it?" She looked back at the seam in the stone, the almost door, the feature that was too deliberate to be accidental and too hidden to be incidental. She thought about Clara's letter in her jacket pocket, and the 3 letters in the County Historical Society, and the keystone carvings that Lily's photograph had captured in such clear detail, waiting to be read by someone who understood what they were looking at. "I think I found the beginning of it," she said, "which is a start." She climbed back up the rope to where her daughters were waiting, and the 3 of them stood on the old stone bridge in the afternoon light with the gorge below them and the canopy of trees arching overhead. And Maggie looked at the bridge, the way you look at something when you have just begun to understand that it has been keeping a secret for longer than any of you has been alive, and that the secret, whatever it costs to reach, was meant for exactly this. The family had laughed. Dana had called it a burden. Brett had said the number $- with the casual certainty of a man who had never been wrong about anything he cared enough to type. Her mother had stirred her coffee. And all of them, every last one of them, had looked at the old bridge at the end of the gravel road in Harrow Creek and seen exactly what the bridge intended them to see. A ruin, a liability, a thing that had outlasted its usefulness and was waiting to be rid of. None of them had thought to look underneath. She did not go back to the gorge the next day, or the day after that. This was not because she had lost her nerve, or because Dana's voice had crept back in and convinced her to be reasonable, but because she was smarter than that now. Smarter than she had been 8 months ago when she had trusted blindly and moved through her own life with the comfortable inattention of someone who believed the structure holding everything up was solid. She had learned something in those 8 months about the relationship between rushing and ruin. When she had learned that the gap between knowing something and being ready to do something about it could look like hesitation from the outside and could feel, from the inside, like the most important kind of patience. What she did instead was study. She did it the way she had studied for the exams that had gotten her through community college, and then the 2 years at the state university before the money ran out and the plan changed, which was to say, she did it with complete focus and without apology. In the early mornings, before the girls woke up, and in the late evenings after they went to sleep. And sitting at her mother's kitchen table with Clara's books from the cottage stacked beside her laptop, and the photographs she had taken on her phone transferred to the screen so she could zoom in on the details that had not been visible to the naked eye in the gorge. She learned about arch bridge construction with the focused urgency of a student who has a deadline and knows it. She learned about the internal structure of a limestone arch, how the voussoirs were stacked to transfer load, and how the spandrel walls above them filled the space between the arch curve and the road deck. She learned that large masonry bridges of the 19th century sometimes contained interior voids, not structural weaknesses but deliberate spaces, sometimes called hollow spandrels, built to reduce weight without sacrificing strength, the kind of engineering sophistication that most people walking across the road deck above would never suspect was there. She learned that a hollow spandrel structure in a bridge of the Harrow Crossing's size and era could be accessed from the exterior face of the arch if you knew where to look and had a reason to look, and that the face of such an opening, if its builder had wanted it concealed rather than merely unused, could be made to look like ordinary stonework with a quality of craftsmanship that would deceive anyone not looking specifically for it. She studied Milo Dupré. This took longer and yielded less, because Dupré had done exactly what Croft's letter implied he intended to do, which was disappear. He appeared in the county records as the engineer of record on the Harrow Crossing construction permit filed in 1886, on his license number recorded in the permit office ledger in the faded ink of a county clerk who had not known they were writing the name of a man about to become very deliberately invisible. He did not appear again in any county record after 1891. Thomas at the Historical Society found a passenger manifest from a ship departing New York for Halifax in November of that year that included an Monsieur Dupré, occupation engineer, age 38, destination listed as province of Ontario. After that, nothing in any American record. He had gone, as Croft intended, and he had taken whatever he remembered with him. What he had not taken were his drawings, or rather, what he had not been able to take, because Croft had said in the second letter that the drawings were in his own possession, and he intended to keep them there. But drawings made in 1886 by an engineer who emigrated in 1891, and whose employer died in 1903, and whose employer's heirs had sold the bridge to the county without apparent knowledge of anything unusual inside it. Those drawings had to be somewhere. Paper does not simply cease to exist. It gets filed, or it gets burned, or it gets inherited by someone who doesn't know what it is, and puts it in a box, and the box eventually ends up in a collection that ends up, if you are fortunate, in a place like the County Historical Society, under a name that a careful person would know to search. She went back to Thomas on a Thursday morning, leaving the girls at her mother's with their schoolwork and a promise she would be back by noon. She asked him about the Croft estate records, which were not the same as the Croft Meridian correspondence collection, but which she suspected might exist separately, the kind of records generated by the legal settlement of a wealthy man's estate in 1903 that would have included an inventory of personal property. Thomas blinked at her with the expression of someone pleasantly surprised to be asked a question they actually knew the answer to. He went to the back room and was gone for 11 minutes, and came back with a box that was broader and heavier than box 14, and had the words Croft Estate Inventory, Probate 1903 to 1905, written on the side in black marker that was itself probably 40 years old. The inventory was dense and specific in the way that probate inventories are, listing furniture and livestock and household goods and financial instruments with an even-handedness that treated a set of silver candlesticks and a portfolio of railroad bonds with equal documentary weight. Maggie went through it slowly, page by page, looking for anything that could have been drawings or plans or the kind of thing an engineer would produce and a man would keep if the thing the drawings described was important to keep secret. She found it on the 43rd page, listed between a mahogany writing desk and a set of leather-bound account ledgers, a notation that read, technical drawings, assorted engineering, property-specific, one folio case, whereabouts designated per attached instruction. The attached instruction was a single page in a different handwriting from the inventory, which meant it had been added by the estate attorney rather than the inventory clerk, and it stated that the folio case containing technical drawings had been deposited per the late Mr. Croft's specific written direction with the Caldwell County Surveyor's Office for permanent retention as part of the bridge easement records, in the event that the county should require them for maintenance purposes, which the county had apparently never done in the subsequent 120 years. Maggie looked at that page for a long moment. Then she thanked Thomas, returned the box, drove 4 blocks to the county surveyor's office, and asked the clerk at the front desk whether they retained historical records going back to the county's bridge easement agreements from the 1880s and 1890s. The clerk, who was young enough that the question required her to ask her supervisor, came back 5 minutes later with the supervisor, a gray-haired man named Arnold, who said he had been doing this job for 31 years and had never once had anyone come in asking about bridge easement records from that period, and that if she wanted to look, she was welcome to try, but that the pre-1960 records were in the basement in filing cabinets that had not been opened in his memory, and he couldn't promise her anything about their condition. She found the folio case in the 4th filing cabinet she tried, in a drawer labeled H to K, because someone long ago had filed the records under Harrow Crossing rather than Croft. The case was flat and broad, made of heavy cardboard that had gone soft with age, but it held together in the dry basement air well enough that the contents, when she unfolded the case with careful hands, were intact. Inside were 6 large sheets of drafting paper, the heavy blue-lined kind that 19th century engineers used for technical drawings, each one covered in the precise, architectural hand of a man who had understood that accuracy was the point of the exercise. The drawings showed the Harrow Crossing Bridge from 6 different perspectives and at 5 different scales, and on the 4th sheet, in the elevation drawing of the central arch's interior section, clearly labeled in Dupre's careful lettering, was a chamber. It was labeled, with the dry specificity of a technical document, as Vault Space, Interior, Central Pier. Access from Gorge Face, West Elevation, Mechanism Detail. Sheet 6, and on Sheet 6, in a detailed drawing that showed the west face of the central arch pier at a scale of 1 inch to 2 feet, there was the mechanism. 2 stone projections, the ones Maggie had found with her hands in the gorge, each labeled with dimensions and with arrows indicating the direction of movement required to activate them. And between them, at the surface of the arch face, a 3rd element she had not yet located, a keystone at pier level, separate from the decorative keystones at the arch crown, recessed into the face of the stonework, and marked with the notation: engage in sequence, depress and rotate. Single turn counterclockwise, 30-degree lock. She sat in the basement of the county surveyor's office and looked at the drawings of the mechanism that Silas Croft had built into the Harrow Crossing Bridge in 1887, and felt something pass through her that was not quite a sound and not quite a physical sensation, but was something in between, the way very large realizations feel when they arrive, not as surprises, but as confirmations, the way it feels when something you already knew becomes something you can prove. Arnold allowed her to photograph every sheet. She drove back to her mother's apartment. She was 40 minutes late, but did not explain why, because she was not yet ready to explain anything to anyone, and her mother, who understood certain kinds of silence, did not push. For there was a man named Dex Okafor, who ran a small structural engineering consultancy out of an office above a printing shop 2 towns over, and who had been recommended to Maggie by a colleague of her father's who had used him for a foundation assessment on a commercial building, and described him as the kind of person who found old problems interesting rather than inconvenient. Maggie called him on a Friday evening and explained in the most condensed version she could manage that she had inherited an 1887 limestone arch bridge and believed there was a concealed interior chamber in the central pier that she needed to access safely. Dex was quiet for a moment after she finished, and then said, "Okay, that is legitimately the most interesting call I've gotten this year. When do you want to meet?" He came to the bridge the following Tuesday. He was in his mid-40s, compact and deliberate in his movements, with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades learning to read structures the way other people learn to read faces. He walked the bridge deck first, then went down the embankment without the rope, which made Maggie slightly anxious and did not seem to concern him at all, and stood in the gorge looking at the central arch for a long time in the way Maggie had come to recognize as the professional version of what she had been doing herself, the careful seeing that precedes the understanding. He examined the 2 projections she had found, pressing them in the sequence shown in Dupre's drawing, and nodded to himself with the satisfaction of a person who has just confirmed a hypothesis. He found the 3rd element, the pier-level keystone, by running his fingers along the arch face in a slow, systematic sweep about 14 inches to the right of where she had been looking. And when he found it, she heard the brief intake of breath that is the involuntary sound of a professional encountering something they did not fully expect, despite expecting it. He spent 20 minutes examining the seam that marked the door's outline, using a small dental mirror and a flashlight to look into the joint from angles that revealed how cleanly and deliberately The stone had been dressed to conceal it. When he came back up the rope, he sat on the parapet and looked out over the gorge for a moment before saying anything. Then he said, "Whoever built this was exceptional. The concealment is extraordinary for the period. You would never find this without the drawings." "Can we open it?" Maggie asked. He looked at her with the expression of someone who appreciated directness. "The mechanism appears intact. The stone is in good condition, better than I would have expected given the age. The joint around the door shows no structural compromise." He paused. "There are two issues. The first is that I want to do a ground-penetrating radar scan of the pier before we open anything, to confirm the void space is there and to assess its extent. This is not optional if you want to do this safely. The second is that you'll need a counterweight tool to operate the mechanism properly. The keystone rotation requires controlled torque. You can't do it by hand without risking damage to the stone. How long for the radar scan? I can have the equipment here by Thursday. And the tool?" He looked at Dupre's drawing on her phone screen. "I can have something fabricated by Friday morning. It's not a complex piece of engineering." He smiled slightly. Just an unusual one. She asked him how much he would charge. He named a figure that was more than she had, and less than she had feared. And she told him she would have it, which was technically not yet true, but would be true by Thursday if her second interview went the way her first one had gone, which was well enough that they had asked her back, which meant it had actually gone well. She had taken a position the week before as a part-time project coordinator at a non-profit that did infrastructure assessment work for rural counties, a job whose description had made her think of her father and the way he had talked about things built to last, the way he had talked about the difference between work done right and work done fast. She had not told anyone about the job yet, not wanting to hand them a reason to feel their concern had been warranted, but she would tell them eventually. She would tell them a great many things eventually. Thursday was overcast and cold, with the particular kind of cold that announces the end of one season and the start of another, the air carrying a dampness that was not quite rain, but felt like rain's advance notice. Dex arrived at 8 in the morning with the radar equipment in the back of a truck and a graduate student named Priya, who operated the scanner, while Dex explained to Maggie what they were looking at on the monitor, which showed the interior of the pier in cross-section as a series of color-coded density readings, the dense stone showing as dark and uniform, the spaces between structural elements showing as lighter zones, and the vault, which appeared on the screen with a clarity that made all three of them go still, showing as a large pale rectangle inside the pier mass, approximately 12 feet wide and 8 feet deep and 6 feet high, by Priya's measurements from the scan data, located exactly where Dupre's drawing said it would be, behind the concealed door in the west face of the central arch. "It's intact," Dex said. "No collapse, no water intrusion visible in the scan, no significant structural compromise in the surrounding stonework. Whatever is in there has been sitting in a dry, stable cavity for 130 years. Maggie stared at the pale rectangle on the screen, the void that Silas Croft had paid double rates for and sworn an engineer to silence over, and then waited to be forgotten. 130 years of forgetting. The county not knowing, the family not knowing, the whole long chain of ownership and inheritance and passing down arriving here, at this screen, at this pale shape in the stone that was finally about to become something you could look at with your actual eyes rather than a radar scanner. She thanked Priya. She asked Dex to come back the next morning with the tool. He said he would be there at 9. She drove home and put the girls to bed and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the photographs of Dupre's drawings on her phone for a long time without seeing them, because she was not looking at the drawings anymore. She was looking at the pale rectangle in the scan image, the one she had saved as the lock screen on her phone, the one that meant what she thought it meant, the one that had been waiting inside a bridge at the end of a gravel road in a county nobody visited for long enough that the waiting had become its own kind of permanence. She slept 4 hours. She was at the bridge by 7:30. She sat on the bridge deck in the cold morning air and watched the light come into the gorge from the east, the way it arrived in stages, first touching the top of the opposite embankment, and then descending slowly down the stone walls toward the stream bed below, the striations in the rock becoming visible as the light reached them. The browns and grays, and that deep ochre red Lily had called the color of old blood. When the light reached the base of the central arch and illuminated the pale oval of the hidden door, so Maggie felt the morning go very quiet in the way mornings go quiet when something is about to happen that has been a very long time coming. Dex arrived at 9 with a tool that looked simpler than its purpose, a long steel handle with a precision-machined head calibrated to engage the pier-level keystone's recessed face at the correct angle and apply the controlled counterclockwise torque that Dupre's drawing specified. He had machined it himself in a workshop off his garage, he said, working from the dimensions on the drawing, and it had taken him 4 hours the previous evening, which told Maggie something about the kind of person he was that she had already suspected, but now confirmed. He tested the fit against a practice piece he had made at the same time, a stone block drilled to the same specifications, and the head engaged cleanly, and the rotation was smooth and precise. He pronounced it correct. They went down to the gorge. There was a moment, standing in the dry stream bed at the base of the central arch, with the tool in Dex's hands and the morning light on the stone around them, where the weight of what was about to happen settled over the place like something physical, like the air before a storm that has not yet decided whether to break. Maggie had her phone in her hand. She was recording. She had decided on that the previous evening, standing at the kitchen table in her mother's apartment, that whatever happened next was going to be recorded, because the thing about being believed is that it helps considerably to have evidence. Dex engaged the first projection, pressing in the direction Dupre's drawing specified. It moved, more freely than when Maggie had tried it alone, the difference between knowing the correct angle and guessing at it. He engaged the second projection. Then he set the head of the tool against the pier-level keystone, fitting it into the recess that had been dressed into the stone face for this exact purpose, and he applied the slow counterclockwise rotation, and for a moment nothing happened, and Maggie's breath stopped in her chest, and then there was a sound. It was not a dramatic sound. It was not the deep groaning of ancient stone reluctantly yielding, not the cinematic boom of a hidden mechanism giving way. It was a sound, like a very heavy door whose hinges have been oiled only in memory, a dry, some mineral sound of stone moving against stone with the deliberate slowness of something that was built to move only once every long while and has been waiting for the occasion. A grinding that was almost gentle, a release that took 4 full seconds to complete, and then the section of the arch face that had been a wall for 130 years was a door, and the door was open, and beyond it was a darkness that was not the darkness of emptiness, but the darkness of a space that had been closed for a very long time and was not used to light. Dex stepped back. He held out his flashlight to Maggie without a word. She understood. This was hers. She took the flashlight and stepped forward and put her hand on the edge of the stone door, which swung inward on the concealed pivot hinge that Dupre had engineered with the same precision he had brought to everything else, and she stepped through. The vault was exactly 12 feet wide and 8 feet deep and 6 feet high, as the radar had measured it. The floor was stone, cut level and smooth. The walls were the interior face of the pier's limestone construction, the surfaces dry and cool and carrying the particular quality of undisturbed air that sealed spaces develop over time, a stillness that is not the same as emptiness and is not the same as silence, but is something that has elements of both. She stood in the entrance and swept the flashlight across the interior, and what it found made her stop moving entirely. The way you stop when the thing you have been trying to believe is possible resolves suddenly into something actual, something you are standing in front of, something you could reach out and touch. The vault was not empty. It had never been empty. It had been waiting, as Croft had intended, and Clara had believed, and now Maggie understood, with the patience of stone. Along the back wall and the right side wall, stacked with the methodical density of someone who had thought carefully about weight distribution and space efficiency, were wooden crates. Not the frail packing crates of imagination, not things that had rotted and collapsed under the weight of time, but heavy-built, iron-strapped wooden cases, the kind constructed by men who understood that their contents required a certain permanence of enclosure, their wood darkened with age, and the iron strapping tarnished to near black, but structurally intact, the iron corners still holding the joints closed, the fitted lid still sealed against the case bodies with the close-fitting craft of a cabinet maker rather than a shipping clerk. She counted them in the flashlight beam, 12 crates along the back wall, 8 along the right side wall, 20 crates in total, each one approximately 3 feet long and 18 inches wide and 18 inches deep. The first one she approached was the nearest to the door, positioned as though whoever placed them had intended the first one found to be the first one opened. She set her flashlight on the floor, angled upward to give herself working light, and examined the crate's lid. The iron strapping was tight, but the wood beneath it had shrunk slightly with the centuries of temperature change, leaving just enough gap between lid and case body for the edge of the small pry tool Dex had thought to bring, clipped to his belt, and which he handed to her wordlessly from the doorway. She worked the edge in, applied slow, careful pressure, and the lid came free with a sound that was not loud, but felt loud in the sealed air of the vault, the compressed silence releasing with the lid's separation from the case body. Inside the crate, packed in what had once been sawdust, but had compressed over time into a dense, fibrous matting that had dried and compacted around its contents without rotting, were ingots. They were rectangular, approximately 10 inches long and 3 inches wide and 2 inches deep, and they were gold. There was no question about what they were. There was no mistaking the color, which is not the bright yellow of jewelry or the pale metallic sheen of gilt paint, but the particular warm, deep, almost living color of refined gold, the color that human beings have recognized and responded to for the entirety of recorded history, with a consistency that suggests it touches something older than culture. In the compressed sawdust packing she could count, pressing carefully at the edges of the matting to reveal the stacked rows, 16 ingots in the visible top layer and the sense of further layers below that. She sat back on her heels on the floor of the vault and looked at what she was looking at, and did not say anything for what felt like a long time. Later, she would estimate it as perhaps 15 seconds. In those 15 seconds, she thought of Dana's voice on the phone. She thought of Brett's text message, $. She thought of her mother stirring her coffee. She thought of the locksmith arriving with his cheerful certainty. She thought of Rosie, asleep against a duffel bag in the back seat of a car 3 payments behind. She thought of Lily's face when she understood that they were not going home. She thought of Clara, sitting alone in the cottage at the end of the bridge for 40 years, reading her engineering books and keeping watch and trusting that somewhere in the family there was someone who would understand what she had left them. Then she picked up the flashlight and went through the other 19 crates. She did not go through all of them that day, not entirely. Some of the crate lids required more effort than the first, and she did not want to rush, did not want to force anything that could be damaged by forcing, did not want the urgency she felt in her chest to translate into carelessness with things that had survived 130 years of careful concealment by being handled carefully. What she did was open each lid far enough to confirm the contents, to see what was in each one, and what she found across the 20 crates was not uniform, but was consistently, overwhelmingly, beyond what Clara's letter had suggested and what Maggie's imagination had managed to produce in the sleepless hours before this morning. 14 of the 20 crates contained gold ingots. The ingots were not all the same size. Some were the 10-inch bars of the first crate, which she would later learn were a standard refinery bar of the period, each one weighing approximately 27 pounds troy. Others were smaller, what would later be identified as kilobars, 100 of them to a crate, each weighing approximately 32 troy ounces. The count, when Dex helped her do the rough math on the back of his field notebook, came to a number that required them to do it twice, and then a third time, before either of them was willing to commit to it as correct. 3 of the remaining crates contained coins, American double eagles, the $20 gold piece minted through most of the 19th century, and the currency in which a man like Croft, who did not trust paper and did not trust banks with the totality of his wealth, would naturally have converted a portion of his holdings. Seldarks. They were not loose, but sleeved, individually wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and was now a dry, fibrous remnant of it, each sleeve still protecting its coin from the direct contact with the air that would have begun the slow oxidation that affects even gold at the surface level over sufficient time. The coins, when Maggie worked one free of its sleeve, were in the condition that numismatists would later use the word extraordinary to describe, not worn, not scratched, not the coins of daily commerce, but coins that had been acquired directly and sealed immediately and had spent their entire existence in the sealed, dry, stable darkness of this vault. The final 3 crates contained documents, not paper documents, which would not have survived the conditions of a century in a stone vault, regardless of how dry it had been kept, but documents on something that wasn't paper. A material Dex identified as vellum, the treated animal skin that scribes and legal professionals had used for records that needed to survive longer than paper could promise. The vellum had survived. The documents on it were written and stamped, and in some cases sealed with wax that had hardened to the consistency of stone, and they were, even without a specialist to interpret them, clearly legal instruments of significant complexity, the kind of thing that describes ownership and transfer and obligation across large amounts of something valuable, with names and amounts and dates written in the formal, careful script of professional legal clerks from the 19th century. Maggie photographed every crate, every ingot she could see, every coin sleeve, every document, when she spent an hour in the vault, and then sat in the entrance of the door in the arch face, and looked out at the gorge and the dry stream bed, and the walls of ancient striated rock, and the narrow strip of pale sky above. And she thought about Clara's letter and the phrase she had written near the end of it. I would like the bridge to win. She thought the bridge had won. She thought Clara would have liked knowing that. She told no one for 48 hours. This was not a decision she made explicitly, so much as a state she fell into naturally. The way you fall into a kind of careful quiet when you are holding something that is larger than your current ability to carry it, and you need time to find the right grip before you can move. She went about the ordinary work of her days, the 2 mornings of the new job, the school pickups, the dinners at her mother's table, the evenings of homework and bedtime, and the particular exhausted tenderness of putting your children to sleep when you are the only adult in the room, and the room is not your own. She lived these 48 hours in the ordinary way, while carrying the vault inside her like a second thing, a doubled weight that was also, paradoxically, a kind of ballast, the weight that keeps a ship upright in rough water. On the third day, she called Arthur Pruitt. She told him she had found something in the property he needed to know about, something significant, and that she needed guidance on how to proceed. He was quiet for a moment, and then said, in the careful tone of a lawyer who has learned not to lead with surprise, that she should come in as soon as possible and should not, in the meantime, and discuss the matter with anyone else or remove anything from the property. She told him she understood. She drove to his office that afternoon while the girls were at school and sat across from him and told him what she had found and showed him the photographs on her phone. And Arthur Pruitt, who had been a county estate attorney for 30 years and whose professional temperament was about as resistant to visible reaction as a person's could be, looked at the photographs of the gold ingots and the coin crates and the vellum documents, and then set the phone face down on his desk and pressed both palms flat on the desk surface and looked at the ceiling for 3 full seconds before he said anything. Then he said, "We're going to need specialists." The specialists arrived in stages, the way serious things arrive. Not all at once in a single overwhelming moment, but in sequence, each one building on the work of the one before, the whole process having the character of something being assembled rather than something being discovered, though in fact it was both at once. Arthur Pruitt managed the process with a methodical care that Maggie came to deeply appreciate, because the alternative was chaos, and chaos, at this scale, had implications she did not want to find out about firsthand. The first specialist was a structural engineer hired independently of Dex, not because Dex's assessment was in question, but because a second opinion on the vault's structural integrity and the bridge's overall condition was necessary before anything was removed, and because having 2 engineers agree on the structural soundness of a concealed vault inside an 1887 bridge pier would be the kind of documentation that subsequent processes would require. The second engineer, a woman named Dr. Renata Solis, who worked with a university lab and had written 2 papers on 19th century masonry bridge construction, spent 4 hours in and around the vault and emerged from the gorge with a notebook full of observations and an expression that was professionally composed and personally delighted. She confirmed Dex's assessment. The vault was sound. The bridge was sound. The contents could be safely removed with appropriate care. The second specialist was a gold and precious metals appraiser from a nationally certified firm, a man named Warren Chu, who flew in from the city and arrived at the bridge site with 2 colleagues and a set of calibrated equipment in cases, and the brisk efficiency of someone whose entire professional life had been spent assigning numbers to things that other people found overwhelming to think about numerically. He worked through the vault systematically over 2 days, weighing and measuring and cataloging each ingot and each coin with the focused attention of a man to whom quantities like these were not theoretically possible, but practically real. The difference being the difference between reading about something and doing the arithmetic in front of you. On the second evening, Warren Chu sat across from Maggie and Clara's cottage, with his laptop open and his figures compiled, and he walked her through his preliminary assessment in the careful, clear manner of someone who has learned from experience that certain numbers require a particular delivery if the person receiving them is going to be able to continue the conversation in a productive way. He started with the ingots. The 14 crates of gold bars contained, in total, approximately 4,200 troy pounds of refined gold. He paused there to let her absorb it, which she appreciated. At the current spot price, he continued, which he noted would fluctuate, and which a formal appraisal would address in more precise terms, The gold content of the ingots alone represented a value in the range of $302 million. He let that number sit. Maggie let it sit with it. They both looked at his laptop screen for a moment. Then he addressed the coins. The double eagles were a more complex calculation because their value had two components: their gold content, which was fixed by the coin's weight and purity, and their numismatic value, which depended on date, mint mark, and condition. The condition of these coins, he said, and here his voice shifted slightly, acquiring a quality that she recognized as professional admiration, pressing against professional restraint, was among the finest he had personally encountered in 22 years of precious metals appraisal. Several of the dates and mint marks represented issues that were genuinely rare in any condition. In the condition these coins were in, they would generate significant interest among serious collectors and would almost certainly achieve prices at specialized auction well above the simple gold value. His preliminary estimate for the numismatic premium alone, separate from the gold content, was in the range of $15 to $17 million. She asked about the vellum documents. He told her that assessment was outside his specialty and would require a legal historian and a specialist in 19th century financial instruments, but that his preliminary read of the documents, based on general familiarity with similar instruments from the period, suggested they were bearer bonds and promissory notes in large denominations, potentially redeemable under certain circumstances, or, if not redeemable, as active instruments, potentially of significant historical and archival value. He was careful not to speculate on figures for the documents, but he was also careful, she noted, not to dismiss them. She asked him what the total was. He looked at his screen. He said that the gold content of the ingots and coins, combined with the numismatic premium on the coins based on his preliminary assessment, came to a figure in the range of $319 million, with the documents representing additional value that his assessment could not yet address. He noted that this was a preliminary figure, that a formal certified appraisal process would produce more exact numbers, and that market conditions at the time of any sale or liquidation would affect the final realized value. But he was comfortable, he said, with $319 million as a working figure. $319 million. Clara had been right. Clara had calculated it from a reference to a quantity in a letter written over 100 years ago. Working backward through historical conversion rates and forward through current gold prices, sitting alone in her cottage with her engineering books and her careful mind, and she had come within rounding distance of what Warren Chu had calculated with his calibrated equipment and 22 years of professional expertise. Clara had known. She had spent 60 years knowing and keeping watch and waiting for the right person to follow the trail she had not been able to follow to its end herself. Maggie sat in the cottage after Warren Chu left and looked at the walls, at Clara's books on their shelves, at the low ceiling and the narrow window and the chimney patched with different stone. She thought about the 40 years Clara had spent here, and about what it costs to keep watch on something you believe in when no one else believes in it with you. She thought about the way the family had talked about Clara at those rare gatherings, the particular quality of the dismissal, the slight embarrassment of a family for a member who has made choices that can't be explained in terms the family finds legible. Stubborn, they had said. Eccentric. Couldn't move on. Couldn't think her way to a better situation. She thought about Dana saying, "There's nothing there, Maggie." She thought about Brett typing, "That bridge is worth $. She thought about her mother stirring her coffee. She thought about a 6-year-old in the back seat of a car saying, "Is it ours?" and a mother saying, "It is." And both of them looking at the bridge in the morning light and seeing something the rest of the world had looked at and looked past and decided was nothing. When the whole time, in the dark and the dry silence, 60 feet below the road surface, in a vault sealed by a long dead engineer with a precision that had outlasted everything except the stone itself. The something had been there all along. It had always been there. It had been waiting for someone to stop being told what they were looking at and start looking for themselves. The legal historian and financial instruments specialist was a professor named Dr. Adaize Nwankwo, who came up from the university 3 days after Warren Chu's assessment and spent the better part of a day in the vault with the vellum documents, and handling them with the focused tenderness of someone for whom historical artifacts were not abstractions, but living things. The physical residue of actual people making actual decisions in actual moments that had mattered. She was in her early 60s and had the settled assurance of a scholar who had been doing what she loved for long enough that the love had become identical to the expertise, each one reinforcing the other until neither could quite be separated from the person who held them. She came into the cottage afterward and sat at Clara's table and looked at Maggie with an expression that was both carefully measured and unable to entirely contain itself. She said, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is preliminary, and that the full process of legal and financial verification will take considerably longer than this conversation. Do you understand that?" Maggie said she understood. Dr. Nwankwo said, "The vellum documents are 11 instruments in total. 4 are bearer bonds, issued in 1885 and 1886 by the Meridian Rail and Mining Consortium, which was the legal entity Silas Croft used to hold his business interests. Bearer bonds of this era were, as the name implies, payable to the bearer rather than to a named individual, which means that ownership transferred with physical possession of the document. The question of whether these specific instruments are legally redeemable after 130 years of abandonment is one that will require considerable legal analysis. What I can tell you is that the face value of the 4 bonds, at the rates specified in the instruments, represents a considerable sum, and that there exist legal precedents in several jurisdictions for the redemption of abandoned bearer instruments under certain conditions." She paused. The remaining 7 documents are more complex. 3 appear to be promissory notes for debts owed to the Meridian Consortium by third parties, some of which may be traceably connected to successor companies still in existence. The legal enforceability of these instruments is a significant question that will require specialist legal opinion. But she said, and here she leaned forward slightly, in the way of a person who has saved the most important thing for this exact moment. 2 of the remaining 4 documents are not bonds or notes. They are title instruments, deeds, properly executed and witnessed, for parcels of land. Specifically, for 2 parcels totaling approximately 340 acres in the eastern part of this county, parcels that appear on the 1886 county survey as the principal landholdings of the Meridian Consortium, and which Croft apparently sealed in this vault along with his other assets, rather than transferring them through his estate, which means that, as far as the official record of title is concerned, ownership of those parcels has been in a state of legal suspension for 120 years. She folded her hands. The question of who currently holds title to those parcels and what the current assessed and market value of that land represents will require a title search and legal analysis that I am not positioned to provide. But I can tell you that this county has changed considerably since 1886, and that land in the eastern portion of the county currently commands a very different price than it did when Croft was alive. Maggie looked at the table surface. She thought about 340 acres in a county that had, in the past 20 years, seen significant development in exactly its eastern portions, where the new highway interchange had pulled commerce and construction in a direction that had transformed what had once been farmland and mine-worked hills into something considerably more valuable. She thought about what a title attorney would say when they looked at those two deeds. She thought about the number Warren Chu had given her, 319 million, and the careful way he had noted that the documents represented additional value that his assessment could not yet address. She looked at Dr. Nwankwo. "Is this real?" she said. "Not the gold. I understand the gold. I mean all of it together. Is this actually happening?" Dr. Nwankwo looked at her with the kind of directness that comes from a lifetime of not softening things that don't benefit from softening. "Yes," she said. "It is actually happening. The process ahead of you is long and will require patience and good legal counsel and considerable documentation. But what you have found in that vault is real, and it was yours from the moment you signed for this property. It was just waiting for someone to come and claim it." Maggie sat with that for a moment. The late afternoon light was coming through Clara's small window, at the angle it came through at this time of year, the amber light of a season turning, the kind of light that makes things look more permanent than they usually feel. The engineering books on their shelves, the patched chimney, the table where Clara had sat for 40 years reading and keeping watch and trusting that the right person would come. She thought of Rosie's voice, pressing her face against the car window that first morning. "Is it ours?" She thought of herself saying, "It is." Neither of them had known then what it was. But they had been right, both of them, in the way that matters most, which is the way that turns out to be true. The first person she told was Eunice. This felt right in a way that required no deliberation, the way the correct decision sometimes arrives already made, requiring only acknowledgement rather than the usual grinding labor of figuring out. Eunice had given her Clara's letter. Eunice had been Clara's best friend for 40 years. Eunice had sat with the secret for however long Clara had shared it with her, which, based on what she knew of both women, was probably most of those 40 years. And she had held it with the same quiet faithfulness with which Clara had held it herself, waiting for the envelope to be given to the right person, trusting her own judgment about when that moment had arrived. She deserved to know before anyone else did. She had earned it. Maggie drove up the gravel road on a Thursday evening after the girls were asleep at her mother's and knocked on Eunice's door. The tabby cat was still in the armchair. The percolator was already on. Eunice looked at Maggie's face when she opened the door and said, "You found it." And it wasn't a question any more than her first recognition of Maggie had been a question. The same directness that had made Maggie trust her from the first morning. They sat at the oilcloth table, and Maggie told her everything. The drawings in the surveyor's basement, the mechanism working exactly as Dupré had designed it, the vault, the crates, Warren Chu's assessment, Dr. Nwankwo's analysis of the documents, the number, 319 million, and the land deed still being evaluated on top of that. And Eunice listened to all of it with the stillness of a person who had been carrying the possibility of this story for a very long time, and was now receiving its confirmation with the measured grace of someone who had learned not to spend emotion before it was warranted, but also not to withhold it when it was. When Maggie finished, Eunice was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Clara used to sit at this table on winter evenings, when the road was too icy to drive, and we'd talk about it the way you talk about something you believe in but can't prove, the way you'd talk about a thing you've staked a portion of your life on and can only hope you were right to do." She said once, toward the end, that she didn't need to see it herself. She just needed to know it would be found. She paused. "She would have liked you very much, you know. Not because you found it, because of the way you went about finding it. Because you looked at the thing everyone told you was worthless and decided they were wrong, and then you did the work to find out why." Maggie looked at her hands on the table. She thought about what it costs to be told something is worthless often enough, by enough people, that the doubt begins to feel like your own voice rather than theirs. She thought about the particular fatigue of maintaining a belief that no one around you shares. She thought about Clara in this house, at this table, on winter evenings, talking about it the way you talk about something you believe in but can't prove. She thought, I understand that now. I understand it in my body. She stayed at Eunice's for 2 hours. When she left, the night was cold and clear. The sky over the gravel road salted thick with stars, in the way that sky over rural roads is when there is no other light for miles to compete with them. And she drove home with the windows down, despite the cold, because she needed the air. She needed the sensation of moving through something real and physical, and needed the night to be actual and present against her face, so that the last several weeks did not dissolve into the quality of a dream, the way large things sometimes do when you are still in the middle of them and cannot yet see their full shape. Arthur Pruitt filed the necessary legal notifications with the county on a Friday morning, which was the earliest the process could formally begin, and by Monday afternoon, the word had traveled the specific distances that words travel in a county of this size, which is to say, it had traveled every distance simultaneously and in all directions at once. Maggie found out how far it had gone when Dana called her at 7:15 on Tuesday morning before she had made coffee, which was a thing Dana had never once done in the history of their relationship as sisters. Dana being constitutionally opposed to communicating before 9, except in circumstances she classified as genuine emergencies. The call was 3 minutes long and consisted primarily of Dana saying, "Is it true?" and Maggie saying yes, and Dana going quiet in the way of a person recalibrating a very large number of previously held certainties, and then Dana saying, "I don't even know what to say," and Maggie saying, "That's okay," and then a silence that was not entirely uncomfortable, which was perhaps the most honest exchange they had managed in several years. Brett called 20 minutes after Dana, from a number Maggie almost didn't answer, and his call lasted considerably longer than Dana's and was considerably less comfortable, or because Brett's response to being wrong was more complex than Dana's and traveled through several stages before arriving anywhere useful, beginning with the suggestion that the valuation must be preliminary and probably inflated, and ending, after 15 minutes of Maggie saying very little, with something that, in a man less committed to his own certainty, might have been called an apology, and in Brett's case was the closest approximation he was capable of producing, which was a long pause, followed by the admission that he might have been hasty with the text about negative dollars. Maggie accepted this without comment, which was more generous than Brett had earned, and possibly more than he recognized he was receiving, but which felt, to her, like the correct amount of energy to spend on it. She had other things to do with her energy now. Her mother was different. Her mother called in the late morning on the same Tuesday, after the earlier calls had come and gone, and her voice had a quality that was not the cautious neutrality Maggie associated with Patricia in uncertain situations, but something rawer than that, something that had been scraped down to the layer beneath the careful management. She said, "I heard." And then she said, "I'm sorry, Maggie." And Maggie knew that she was not apologizing for the coffee stirring specifically, or for any single moment of expressed doubt, but for the accumulated weight of all of it together, the whole long year of believing in the version of her daughter that was defined primarily by what had gone wrong rather than by what Maggie was capable of. It was not a complete apology, and they both knew it, the way you both know when something is the beginning of a reckoning rather than the reckoning itself, but it was real, and Patricia Donovan did not offer things she did not mean, which meant this one mattered. Maggie said, "I know, Mom. It's okay." and she meant that too. The formal process of confirming, legally protecting, and ultimately liquidating or managing a discovery of this magnitude was nothing like the movies make it look. There were no dramatic press conferences, no moment where a single authority figure pronounces the number official and hands over a check and the matter is resolved. There was instead a sequence of interlocking processes, each one generating the documentation that the next one required, the whole thing moving at the pace of legal and institutional caution, which is a pace that Maggie had to learn to accept without losing herself to the urgency she felt in her chest every morning when she woke up and remembered what was real. Arthur Pruitt assembled a team. There was a title attorney named Ruth Shapiro, who specialized in historical property disputes and who described the two land title deeds with the contained excitement of a person who understood that she was looking at something genuinely unusual. There was a securities law specialist who examined the vellum bearer bonds and promissory notes and confirmed that while the path to any recovery on those instruments was complex and not guaranteed, 3 of the 4 bearer bonds were issued by an entity that had a traceable successor company, and that the legal theory for redemption, while untested at this specific scale, had defensible precedent. There was a tax attorney, because there is always a tax attorney, and his role in the proceedings was to ensure that the discovery was structured and reported correctly from the first filing forward, so that the government's legitimate interest in the matter was addressed in a way that did not consume the inheritance, but also did not invite the kind of scrutiny that comes from attempting to minimize what cannot honestly be minimized. The golden coins were transferred to a secure facility by a company that specialized in the movement of high-value assets and whose people arrived at the bridge site on a gray November morning with the quiet professionalism of people for whom this work was routine, although the scale of this particular job gave even them a visible moment of adjustment when they saw the full count of the crates. The transfer took the better part of 2 days and was documented at every stage by video and by Arthur Pruitt's associate, who stood at the vault entrance with a clipboard and accounted for every item as it left. The process of removal was careful and slow, the iron-strapped crates lifted and carried with a respect for the contents that Maggie appreciated and that Dex, who came to watch, noted aloud, was the correct way to treat things that had survived this long through being handled with care. The vellum documents were transferred separately, under the supervision of Dr. Nwankwo and a conservator she had recommended, or into a climate-controlled archive at the university, where they could be properly preserved while the legal analysis of their status continued. Dr. Nwankwo had already engaged a colleague in the law school to begin the process of evaluating the redemption question for the bearer bonds, and she had written to 2 other scholars of 19th-century corporate law, whose expertise she felt the promissory notes warranted. The process, she told Maggie, would take the better part of a year. Maggie said she understood. She was getting very good at understanding that things took the time they took, and that patience was not the same as passivity. The title search on the 2 land parcels, which Ruth Shapiro undertook with a focused thoroughness that Maggie found genuinely impressive, produced results that arrived in stages over the following 6 weeks, each stage adding another layer to a picture that had begun as uncertain and was gradually, unmistakably, resolving into something extraordinary. The 2 parcels totaling 340 acres in the county's eastern section had, as the county's records showed, been legally assigned to the Meridian Consortium under Croft's control and had never been formally transferred out of that entity's ownership. The Meridian Consortium had been dissolved in 1905, 2 years after Croft's death, in a probate process that had failed to account for the parcels because the title deeds were not with the estate's papers and were not, apparently, known to the estate attorneys to exist. 120 years of legal suspension, during which portions of the land had been used by adjacent landowners under various informal arrangements, One section had been leased and farmed. Another had been logged twice. A third had sat dormant under a county conservation designation that had been applied in 1988 to land whose ownership status the county itself did not clearly understand. The current assessed value of the land, Ruth told Maggie in a meeting that also included Arthur Prewitt and the tax attorney, was just under $31 million. The market value, given the development patterns in the eastern section of the county and two parcels that were, Ruth noted with the careful phrasing of a professional who had learned not to raise expectations unnecessarily in locations that commercial developers had been seeking for several years without finding available land, was likely to be considerably higher than the assessed value. She was not prepared to name a figure, she said, but she was prepared to say that the title, recovery alone, if it proceeded as the evidence currently suggested it would, represented a significant additional sum on top of the gold and coin valuation. Maggie sat in Arthur Prewitt's conference room and looked at the table and thought about Brett's text message one more time, the last time she intended to think about it, and then she put it away. Not because it no longer mattered, but because it had served its purpose, which was to represent the complete certainty of people who had looked at a thing and decided they knew everything about it without looking at what was underneath, and that particular lesson had now been thoroughly learned and did not require further review. She told Lily first, because Lily had been there at the beginning without knowing it, had asked the right questions on the bridge before Maggie had known those were the right questions, had tied the rope to the railing post with a quiet competence that was entirely characteristic of her, and had never once asked for recognition for it. She told her on a Sunday afternoon in November, sitting at the kitchen table in the apartment they had moved into 6 weeks earlier, the one they were renting on the strength of Maggie's job income and a security deposit that Arthur Prewitt had advanced from the estate, pending the formal completion of the asset transfer, from a 2-bedroom on a tree-lined street 3 miles from Lily and Rosie's school, with a kitchen that got morning light and a living room where the girls had arranged their things with the careful intentionality of people who understood what it meant to have a place that was theirs. Lily listened to the whole story from the beginning, the way she listened to everything, with her full attention and the particular stillness she brought to things that mattered. When Maggie finished, Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's why the keystones had the carvings. They weren't just decoration. They were Dupré marking what he built." Maggie looked at her daughter. "Yes, I think that's exactly right." Lily thought about this, and Clara figured it out from the letters in the Historical Society. From the letters, and a lot of years of paying attention, yes. Lily nodded slowly, processing. Then she said, "Is this going to change everything?" "It's going to change a lot of things," Maggie said. "But the things that matter, the things that are actually us, those don't change because of money. Those are already what they are." Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to important statements, evaluating rather than simply accepting. Then she said, "I want to keep going to Jefferson." Maggie had expected this. "You can keep going to Jefferson. And I want to keep my room how it is." "You can absolutely keep your room how it is." Lily's expression shifted, the seriousness giving way briefly to something lighter. "Although," she said, "if we were going to get a dog, now would probably be a good time." Maggie laughed. The sound of it surprised her, the ease of it, the way it came up without effort and filled the kitchen with the particular quality of genuine laughter, the kind that is not performed for anyone, but is simply the body's honest response to something that is actually funny. She had not laughed like that in a long time. It felt like something returning. It felt like a season turning. They told Rosie together that evening. Rosie's response was characteristically direct and characteristically her own. She listened to the abbreviated version Maggie offered, the age-appropriate summary that focused on the idea that Clara had left them something important hidden in the bridge that turned out to be very valuable. And when Maggie finished, Rosie thought about it for 3 seconds and then said, "So the bridge was like a present, but from a long time ago." "Exactly like that," Maggie said. Rosie nodded, satisfied. "Did we say thank you to Clara?" "We're going to," Maggie said. "We're going to figure out a good way to do that." Rosie thought about it. "We should plant something," she decided. "Mom always said you say thank you with growing things." Maggie looked at her younger daughter, at the complete unself-conscious confidence with which she had arrived at the correct answer, and felt the thing behind her sternum that had been a rope being pulled taut for the better part of a year. Release, just like that, like a knot coming undone, like water finding its level. She put her arms around both her daughters and held them in the kitchen of the apartment that was theirs, in the life that was theirs, in the late evening light of a November that was ending the hardest year any of them had lived through. And she was grateful in a way that had no adequate language, the kind of gratitude that lives in the body rather than in words. The formal confirmation of the gold and coin valuation came through in December, in a document from the certified appraisal firm that confirmed Warren Chu's preliminary figures with the precision of a completed process rather than a working estimate. The number was $322,418,000, the slight upward adjustment from the preliminary $319 million, reflecting a movement in the spot gold price between the preliminary and the formal assessment dates, and a numismatic premium on several of the double eagle coins that had come in higher than the initial estimate, when the complete catalog was presented to a specialist in rare American coinage, who had not been able to restrain his response to certain dates and mint marks to anything approaching professional detachment. He had, according to Warren Chu's report, actually said the word extraordinary aloud 3 times in the same sentence when he first examined the 1879 C.C. St. Gaudens series coins, which Warren noted in his report with the dry fondness of someone who had worked with this particular specialist before and was not surprised. $322 million. The difference between the working figure and the confirmed figure was $3 million, which was itself a sum so far outside Maggie Donovan's former frame of financial reference that the distinction between 319 and 322 felt simultaneously enormous and abstract, the way all numbers beyond a certain scale feel when they are attached to your own name, rather than to a statistic you read somewhere and immediately forget. She was learning, in this period, the specific psychological work that significant wealth requires of people who have arrived at it from a position of scarcity, the work of internalizing a changed reality without losing the judgment that the previous reality had sharpened. It was not easy work, and she was not always sure she was doing it correctly, but she was doing it carefully, which was what she had available, and careful, as she had learned over the past year, usually turned out to be enough. The bearer bond redemption proceedings, when they concluded the following spring after 11 months of legal analysis and negotiation with the successor company's counsel, added another $18 million to the total after legal fees and taxes, a figure that Ruth Shapiro described as a very favorable outcome, given the complexity of the legal theory and the 120-year gap in the chain of evidence. The land title recovery, which was completed in the same month through a negotiated settlement that avoided the full litigation that had been a possibility in the early stages, resolved at a figure that reflected the market rather than the assessed value, the development interest in those specific parcels having been confirmed by the interest of 3 separate commercial entities who had contacted Ruth Shapiro's office within a week of the title recovery becoming public record, which told its own story about how well Silas Croft had chosen his land 140 years ago, even if the reasons for his choice had nothing to do with the development patterns of a county he could not have imagined. The land settled for $44 million. Maggie kept 20 of the 340 acres, the portion that contained the gorge and the bridge and the cottage and enough of the surrounding land to give the bridge the setting it deserved. The rest she sold, because land that she could not use was not the same as the bridge, which she would never sell, which was not for sale at any price, and which she would have been unable to explain to anyone who needed the explanation. The way you cannot explain to certain people the difference between a thing's monetary value and its actual value. The gap between what something is worth on a balance sheet and what it is worth in the context of the life it belongs to. What she did with the money was a question she had begun thinking about long before the final figures were confirmed, because the question of what to do with a life-changing sum is not a question that waits politely for the sum to be finalized before making itself felt. She thought about it in the early mornings at the kitchen table, and on the drive to work, and in the evenings after the girls were asleep, and she thought about it in the particular way she had been taught by the events of the past year to think about important things, which was slowly and with attention to the difference between what seemed right immediately and what would still seem right when she looked at it from a distance. She kept the apartment for another 6 months, not because they could not afford to move, which they could abundantly, but because she was not ready to make a permanent decision about where they would live until she was sure the decision was coming from the right place, from actual desire rather than from the reflexive impulse to prove something by the size of what you acquire. She had watched enough people make that mistake, had grown up adjacent enough to the demonstration of it, to know that the house you buy to tell a story about yourself is never quite the home you live in, and she wanted a home, not a story. She paid off the car. This was the first thing she did, not because it was the most financially significant thing she could do, but because it was the most emotionally specific, the car being the physical object most thoroughly associated in her mind with the worst morning of the year, the morning of the parking lot on Route 9, with the bruised sky and the girls asleep in the back seat and the gas gauge above empty. She drove it to the dealership and paid the outstanding balance in full and drove it home. And it was the same car it had been before, and also completely different. The way things are when what changes is not the thing itself, but your relationship to it. She put the full amount required for both girls' college education into irrevocable trust accounts, structured by the tax attorney with the specificity of someone who understood that the purpose was not flexibility, but permanence. The unassailable certainty that Lily and Rosie would be able to go wherever they were capable of going, without the obstacle of money being the reason they could not. She did not tell the girls how much was in the accounts. She told them the accounts existed, that the money was there, that they should choose their paths based on what they wanted to do rather than what they thought they could afford. She said, "Your great-great-aunt Clara believed that the right opportunities come to people who do the work to be ready for them. The money is there so you can be ready. What you do with the readiness is your part." Lily said, "That's a very Clara thing to say." Maggie said, "I'm going to take that as a compliment." Rosie said, "Can we get the dog now?" They got the dog. The Clara Voss Foundation was Arthur Prewitt's suggestion, gently and correctly made, that the naming was the right thing to do, and that the timing was right to establish it. The foundation's purpose was specific rather than broad, because Maggie had learned from observing the way vague intentions dissipate, and specific ones hold that it was better to do one thing with clarity than many things with ambiguity. The foundation provided direct financial support to women in the county who were navigating housing instability with children, the kind of immediate, practical assistance that Maggie understood from the inside, the security deposit that makes the difference between having an address and not having one, the car repair that makes the difference between keeping the job and losing it, the gap between the situation you are in and the situation from which you can begin to move forward. It was not a large foundation by the standards of the philanthropic world. it was not trying to be. It was trying to be useful in the way that Clara, reading her engineering books alone in the cottage for 40 years, had been useful, which was to do the specific necessary thing with competence and without fanfare and trust that the thing done well would compound in ways you could not fully predict. Eunice came to the small gathering at the cottage when the foundation was officially announced, and she sat in Clara's chair at the table and looked at the room with the expression of someone completing a very long sentence, the expression of a person for whom a thing that has been promised for a long time is finally and actually delivered. She did not say much. She did not need to. She drank her coffee from Clara's mug, the one she had apparently always used when she visited, and she looked at Maggie with the direct, clear-eyed regard that had characterized her from the first morning on the porch, and she said, she would have said it was about time. Maggie said, she would have been right. Eunice allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Yes, she said. She usually was. The house they eventually chose was not what anyone who knew Maggie before the year of the bridge would have expected her to choose, and also, once they saw it, like was exactly what anyone who knew Maggie after that year would have predicted without surprise. It was not the largest house in the county, or the most architecturally prestigious, or the one with the address that announced a particular kind of arrival. It was a farmhouse, a substantial one, with wide plank floors and windows that let the light in from 4 directions, and a kitchen with a long table and a garden that had been someone else's project and was now ready to become hers, sitting on 12 acres of the eastern parcel she had retained in the land settlement, 12 acres that backed against the tree line above the gorge and were close enough to the bridge that on a still morning in the right season she could hear, faintly, the sound of the wind moving through the iron railings on the parapet, which produced a sound she could not quite describe, except to say it was like the bridge breathing. The girls chose their rooms on a Saturday morning in early spring, Lily with the focused deliberateness of someone who had already been thinking about this for weeks and had specific requirements involving natural light and proximity to the bookshelf she intended to build herself. Rosie with the joyful spontaneity of a 7-year-old who understood that this was a moment of genuine abundance and was not going to waste it on careful consideration when enthusiasm was so much more immediately available. The dog, a large, amiable, somewhat chaotic rescue named Edmund, who had been with them for 4 months and had already distinguished himself by eating one of Lily's notebooks and sitting on the gas gauge display of the car, as explored the farmhouse with the systematic thoroughness of a creature who understood that territory must be claimed personally and without delegation. Dex Okafor came for dinner on the first evening they spent in the house, because Maggie had decided early that the people who had been part of the bridge's story belonged in the life that followed from it. Not as symbols, but as actual people with actual relationships, the kind that are maintained through dinner and conversation, rather than through sentiment alone. Dr. Nwankwo came. Arthur Prewitt came with his wife, who turned out to have opinions about garden design that were both strong and correct. Thomas from the Historical Society came and brought a gift that was a framed reproduction of Dupre's original drawings, which he had requested permission to display in the Historical Society's new civil engineering exhibition, an exhibition that had come into being partly because the Harrow Crossing discovery had generated more public interest in the county's 19th century construction history than Thomas had ever dared to hope for, and which he described with the quiet joy of a man who has spent a career loving something that most people ignore as the best thing that had happened to the collection in his memory. Eunice came and sat in the chair closest to the window, which was the chair with the best view of the tree line above the gorge, and ate her dinner and watched the children and said little and seemed entirely content in the way of a person who has arrived exactly where they intended to be. There is a thing that happens, Right after the year of the bridge, that Maggie finds difficult to describe to people who ask her what changed and how, because the answer they expect is a financial answer, an accounting of the distance between before and after, measured in the terms that the before had been defined by: the absence of security, the 3 payments behind, the gas gauge above empty. And all of that did change, completely and permanently, and in ways she would not minimize, because minimizing hardship that has actually occurred does no one any service. But the change that feels most real to her, most central to the difference between the person she was in the parking lot on Route 9 and the person sitting at the long table in the farmhouse kitchen now, is not the financial one. The change is something harder to name. It has to do with what she learned in the year of looking at the bridge while everyone told her what she was looking at, and refusing, not loudly or dramatically, but simply and persistently, to accept their version in place of her own. It has to do with the particular education of being in a situation where you have nothing left to lose except your own judgment, and discovering that your judgment, held to, maintained in the face of doubt and dismissal and the accumulated pressure of people who love you, telling you that you're wrong, turns out to be something you can trust. Not because it's always right. It is not always right. But because it is yours, and knowing that you will follow it rather than abandon it. When the pressure comes, changes the quality of everything. Changes the way you stand in your own life, the way you look at things, the particular stillness of a person who has found their footing in the specific ground they are actually standing on, rather than the ground other people keep telling them they should be standing on instead. Clara had that quality. Eunice had named it correctly the first morning, sitting on the porch. She saw it in Maggie's eyes, the way they looked at things and wanted to understand them rather than just get past them. Clara had sat with the bridge for 60 years, not because she had no choice, not because stubbornness had simply become habit, but because she understood something about the relationship between patience and worth that her family and the county and the long, ordinary indifference of the world around her had not been able to argue her out of. She had been right, and the being right had mattered less to her than the being faithful, the faithfulness to the thing she could see that others couldn't, the thing inside the stone that everyone else looked at and called nothing. Maggie thinks about this on mornings when she walks the bridge. She walks it regularly, not for exercise particularly, but because the bridge requires a kind of presence from her, a maintenance of relationship that she takes seriously, in the way you take seriously the things you have been given by people who paid a price for them that you did not. The stonework is kept now, the parapet repointed by a masonry conservation firm that Dr. Solis recommended, the iron railings treated and preserved, the deck cleared of the weeds that had been making their patient claim on the joints between the stones. The small birch tree in the parapet crack was a question she thought about for a long time before deciding, and the decision she arrived at was to let it stay. It had established itself in a crack in a 130-year-old stone bridge and grown 4 feet tall and survived everything, including a year of no one paying attention, and that seemed like sufficient argument for its right to continue. Rosie named the birch. She named it Clara, which Maggie discovered not by being told, but by finding a small painted sign tucked into the parapet base near the tree's roots one afternoon, painted on a flat piece of scrap wood in Rosie's careful, uneven 7-year-old lettering. Clara. Maggie stood there on the bridge looking at the sign for a moment, and then she took a photograph of it and sent it to Eunice, who did not respond for several hours and then sent back a single sentence. She would have been very pleased with that. Dana came to the farmhouse in the autumn following the move, not to the open house that Maggie had hosted for neighbors and friends in the spring, but on an ordinary Tuesday evening with a bottle of wine and the slightly uncertain manner of a person who has something to say and is not entirely sure how to begin. Maggie let her in and poured the wine and sat with her at the long table in the kitchen while Edmund investigated Dana's bag with the thorough shamelessness of a dog who has learned that bags sometimes contain interesting food and has decided this is a principle worth testing consistently. Dana talked about the family for a while, the ordinary updates that function as the first layer of conversation between people who share a history but are still finding their current footing. And then she went quiet in a way that was different from her usual conversational pauses, and she looked at the kitchen, at the evening light and the garden through the window, and Edmund's investigation of her bag. And then she said, "I was wrong. I know I was wrong. Not just about the bridge, about the year, about all of it. I said things that I should not have said, and I was so certain when I said them." Maggie looked at her sister. Dana's face had the specific quality of someone who has arrived at honesty by a difficult route and is not going to dress it up or soften it because it cost enough to get here that it deserves to be delivered plain. Maggie thought about everything she could say. She thought about the call, the burden, that there's nothing there. She thought about all of it. Then she thought about what mattered and what didn't, the way you can only think clearly about that question when you are no longer in the middle of the thing that made it hard, when the distance is large enough to see the shape of it. She said, "I know, and I know you were scared for me. Those aren't the same thing, being wrong and being unkind. But they're also not entirely separate. I know both were in it." Dana looked at her. "Yes," she said, "both were in it." Then they had their wine, and Dana stayed for dinner, and Lily showed her the bookshelf she had built herself, each shelf level confirmed with a borrowed spirit level, and sanded smooth with the methodical patience she brought to everything she decided was worth doing properly. And Rosie showed her the painting she had made of the bridge that hung now in the farmhouse front hall. A child's painting, but a remarkable one. The three arches correct in their proportions, the gorge below them dark and deep, and rendered in the layered colors Lily had called the color of old blood and old gold and old time. And the whole thing held together with the confident brushwork of someone who was not yet technical, but was already deeply seeing. The way Emma had been, Eleonora had said, all those years ago in an art class, in another story entirely, though Maggie would not know that story, and did not need to, having her own. She is at the bridge on a morning in the second spring, after the vault was opened, standing on the deck in the early light, her hands on the iron railing in the place where she always stands. The place where the first arch meets the second, and the view down into the gorge is deepest. The gorge walls striated and ancient in the morning light. The small birch named Clara, growing quietly in its crack in the parapet 3 feet away. Edmund is with her, which means she is not entirely stationary. The dog's version of standing on a bridge being a periodic patrol from one end to the other, and back with the dedication of a creature who takes his responsibilities seriously. Lily and Rosie are at school. The farmhouse is a 1/4 mile back through the trees, visible through the canopy from this spot in winter, hidden from it now in the full green of May. She thinks about a parking lot on Route 9 on a morning when the sky was the color of a bruise. She thinks about a voice on a phone saying the word bridge with a throat clearing before it, preparing to deliver something unusual. She thinks about her mother stirring her coffee. She thinks about Brett's text message, which she has thought about for the last time, she decides, right now, on this bridge, in this light. She thinks about the dry stream bed 60 feet below her and the concealed door in the arch face, and the sound the stone made when it moved for the first time in 130 years. The dry mineral grinding of something built to last, finally being asked to do the thing it was built to do. She thinks about the pale rectangle on the radar screen, She thinks about what it felt like to step through a door that had been sealed since 1887 and stand in a space where the air had not moved since before anyone currently living was born. She thinks about Clara at this railing, on a morning like this one, looking down into the gorge the way Maggie is looking now, knowing what she knew and trusting what she trusted, and continuing to tend the knowledge and the trust with the unhurried faithfulness of a woman who understood that worth and visibility are not the same thing, that the most important things are frequently the least apparent, that what looks worthless to most people is priceless to those who understand what they are looking at. She had not known Clara. She had not had the chance. That will always be a fact about her life, one of the true losses embedded in the larger story of what was found, and she doesn't try to minimize it or compensate for it by projecting onto Clara a closeness that did not exist. What she has instead is the letter, and the books, and the cottage, and Eunice's 40 years of stories told at the oilcloth table over percolator coffee, and the bridge itself, which is the most complete version of Clara available to her, the thing Clara devoted herself to and kept faith with, and left as the most articulate expression of what she believed. The bridge says everything Clara could not say to her directly. Maggie has learned to read it. The light comes fully into the gorge now, the sun clearing the eastern embankment and striking the stone walls, and the dry stream bed below with the warm, early quality of a May morning. And the bridge glows the amber gold. It always glows in direct light, the pale limestone taking the color into itself and giving it back slightly changed, warmer, as though the stone has been waiting all winter for the chance to do this. Maggie stands at the railing and looks at it, and feels what she always feels here, which is small in the good way, the way of the ocean and the mountain range, the recognition of something that does not know or care about your problems, but somehow makes them feel more manageable anyway, except that this is also, unmistakably, hers. The two feelings together, the bigness and the belonging, the old enduring thing that was here before she came and will be here after, and also, within the span of a single strange and difficult and ultimately transformative year, ours became the realest version of home she has ever known. She had stood in a parking lot with nothing except her daughters and her own judgment, and a key she had not yet decided to accept, and she had called the lawyer back in 7 minutes and said yes, and everything that followed from that yes was a function of what she had refused to stop believing about herself and about the bridge, which is that some things that look like nothing are actually everything, and the difference between the people who find that out and the people who don't is usually not intelligence or luck or financial sophistication, but simply whether, when everyone around you is certain they know what something is worth, you are willing to look for yourself. Rosie had asked, "Is it ours?" And she had said, "It is." Both of them had been right. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen right now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.